Okay, our last question is a GeoGebra graphing function. Looks like we're going to be reviewing some quadratic concepts. And what this problem wants us to do, it wants us to move this large point here, and it wants us to move the slider, which will stretch or compress this graph so that this function is graphing this function here, negative 2x squared plus 4 minus 5. So what I'm going to do to graph this is I want to first factor it, find my zeros, and I can also find my vertex point. All right, so this starts out with a negative. Whenever you're going to factor, you got to factor out the negative first, and then once you factor out the negative, it'll factor correctly. So first, I'm going to factor out a negative 1 because the negative on factoring, you'll still get the zeros, but it'll mess up everything else. So I'm going to factor out a negative 1. That's going to leave me with 2x squared. That's going to be minus 4x, and then this is going to be plus 5. Alright, so the factoring process that I use, I multiply the first, which is the coefficient of the leading term, and the last term, the constant. That gives me 10. And then I'm going to write all the factors of 10. 1 times 10, 2 times 5. And I want to know if I were to add these factors, does anything give me 4? And they do not. So it looks like this won't factor, so I'll have like some rational roots. So what I will do instead, since it doesn't factor correctly, we're going to see if we can do completing the square and put it into what we call vertex form. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. Negative 2x squared plus 4x minus 5. We're going to set this equal to 0. So when you start the completing the square part, this leading term needs to be a 1. So we're going to first, we're going to move the 5 over. So we'll have negative 2x squared plus 4x. We're going to say plus some blank equals 5. So we added 5, move it over. We're going to factor out the negative 2. This needs to be a 1, so factor out the negative 2. Leaves me with x squared. Divide by negative 2, this will be a minus 2x plus some number was 5. Now, whenever you get that, you're going to take this middle term, square it. So negative 2, square it. That is going to give you your missing term. No, I think we got to divide by 2, then square it. Take this middle term, divide by 2 and square it. Sorry. Divide by 2 and then square it. So that's going to give me a negative 1, and then I square it. So negative 1 is the term that I'm going to be adding here. Now, that negative 1 is going to get hit by the 2, so just be aware of that when we start to simplify it. So I'm not just adding negative 1. That negative 2 is going to actually distribute. It's going to become a different number. So whatever I do to one side, I have to add to the other side. So since I added this negative 1, which when you square it is a positive 1, when you factor, that's actually a 2, a negative 2. I need to add that to this side. So I added basically what amounts to a negative 2 here, because 1 squared is 1 times a negative 2 is a negative 2. I need to add a negative 2 to this side. Okay, so that will get us through the completing the square part. So now we're going to factor this side. So there's a shortcut. Whatever the 2 squared terms are, they will come together. So this negative 2 will be on the outside, and I will have my square term, just the x, the square term minus 1. and my square will go on the outside, and then that is going to be equal to 5 minus 2, which is 3. And so my f of x is equal to this. I'm going to move the 3 over. Negative 2x minus 1 squared minus 3. Okay, so this is what we call vertex form. So once you get it into vertex form, we can see our vertex. It is, always do the opposite. So it is 1, our vertex is 1 and negative 3. So that's where I'm going to move my big point to. I'm going to go to 1 and down 3. That's my vertex. Because this is negative, that tells me it opens downward. Okay. So I'm going to make this open downward. Now, one thing I do want to check is the next points, because there is a stretch. So I need to make sure those points are hitting the right value. So there's a pattern when you graph parabolas. Usually you start at 0, 0, and just the standard, you will go up 1, right 1. And you will go up 3, 1, 2, 3, right 1. And so it gets that little curve shape. So you're counting up by an odd number. Well, since this is being multiplied by 2, you're going to go up by 6. So if I were graphing this and it was negative, I would go over 1 and then down. Instead of 1, it would be 2, because that's what that 2 is going to do. It's going to multiply by a factor of 2. Then I'll go over 1 and I'll go down 6. So I'm looking for that point to go over and down 2 spots. So it's over and down 1, so I think I want to go 1 more. You can see how it goes over and down 2 because of that factor of 2. That should give us what we need.